Hello and welcome to the Nordic Mythology podcast. I'm Daniel Farrand, co-owner of the company Horns of Odin, and I'm joined as always by Dr. Mathias Nordvig.
Hello. So this time we are joined by Chad Zuber, who is a survivalist and YouTuber who makes a lot of awesome and really interesting videos about basic survival, all kinds of skills that you need to live in the land, in nature, off the land, so to speak. So welcome, Chad.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with you guys.
Yeah, thank you very much for taking the time. You've also got the best setup anyone's had for video so far.
I love it.
I see that you set a few little items up behind you. I'm going to shame and say I don't really know what most of them are, but it looks really cool.
Yeah, I like to get out there in nature and try to recreate what times were maybe hundreds or thousands of years ago. Try to relive that.
Mm-hmm. I mean, before we get into the episode, I guess what we're going to do is we're going to try and understand how people would have lived in the Viking Age using your expertise of survival and try and get an idea of how things would have been and how tough it would have been using kind of your own expertise and your experiences, I guess. And see what we can piece together. So obviously this is in an exact science, I guess, is a bit more of an experimental episode in that we, but I think it should be good fun and there's a lot to learn there. One thing I have to ask first though is how did you get into all this? So at what point did you go, start everything else? I want to just go and live off the grid and learn how to survive on your own.
Well, it's been a very long process. Ever since as a child, I always loved being in nature, loved exploring, loved collecting things, and just had all that curiosity. And then I just got into the normal routine of life as I grew, and with the working and job, and just felt this great desire to explore. It was just it was in me, and I was just so dissatisfied with my current lifestyle at the time, and it was just always a dream, and I was looking for ways to get out there, to somehow get out into nature. And I got into photography, and that kind of helped open the doors as I was able to go on adventures, and I would document them, and I would take photographs and sell those on stock photo sites. But it was a very slow process. I always, since I was probably about 18, I loved the idea of making movies and video making. And I used to do that with friends a long time ago. And eventually, with YouTube coming out, I started making my own little videos. Typically, they started out being adventure documentaries where I would just go somewhere. Usually it was in Mexico, and get off a bus. I'd identify a particular landscape or geography on maps, and I want to get there. And so I would find buses I could take to these different towns and villages, and then I would get off the bus and start walking, and I would document the trip. And I'd go alone typically. And I just fell in love with the experience. I never had a bad experience, although I was going into places totally unknown to me. Mm-hmm. But it was difficult. It was extremely difficult, but at the same time exhilarating, because I
bet it's really exciting. Kind of,
it is
that unknowing,
the unknown,
but like you say, equally extremely terrifying.
The first time's a little bit, but I very quickly, with every successful mission, I guess you could say, I became more and more comfortable, and the more I learned, and it's particularly learning about myself, and that this is going to be particularly worth talking about in this episode, because I think a lot of people, they fantasize about living off the grid or going on exploration and adventure in the wilderness, and you might see movies, Indiana Jones, and this and that, and but you really don't realize, like, you may be in extremely great health, you're strong, but the only reason that most of us have this strength and great health is because we live in the comforts of a modern society. We don't have these dangers and the elements eating away at us all the time. And so when you take that away, when you take away a constant food supply or water supply, or your 8 hours of rest every night, when you take that away, how does your body respond? And that's that really fascinated me, because on a few trips, they were brutally difficult. I mean, I slept minimal sleep and minimal food, and often dehydration and getting concerned about finding water, and that fear, and then how that your mind can be affected by that when you don't know where your next water is coming from, and you already can't swallow or even talk because your throat is so dry. Moments like that, I drank seawater one time to get some relief, but through the whole process, I learned about my limitations. So you set the walls, the boundaries of like, okay, within these boundaries, I can function. It may be difficult, but I know I can function within these boundaries. And you learn little things and tricks to help you to survive, to get through it. For instance, I found that when I was extremely dehydrated, this was in the Caribbean, a trip I did, found that just going in the ocean, just submersing myself in the water of the ocean, relieved my thirst temporarily.
Wow.
I suppose that through the skin, water is absorbed. And I've heard this of people that have done dry fasts, which is a fast where they don't even drink water. Part of the rule to doing that kind of a fast is they can't touch water during that time. And I believe it's because the skin will actually absorb the water, like kind of like a sponge. And so there's the people of the past, they had all kinds of little tricks and little things that they could do that would help them to survive these very extreme conditions.
I imagine a lot of that is probably lost through time as we've got more and more comfortable. They haven't needed these little tips and tricks anymore. So before we get into necessarily exactly, I think, how maybe the Vikings would relate or how we can relate to that, are you completely self-taught? Have you just kind of learned all this stuff from going out there, trial and error, see what works, see what doesn't, and I guess reading books and doing some research as well? Yeah,
I'm a little interesting in that, because I guess you might say it's not stubbornness, but it's more that I'm open-minded in such a way that I believe that if I'm taught everything, it's going to kind of direct my mind to think this certain way. And I believe there's a lot unknown. There's a lot that's still left to be, I should say, rediscovered. Like, as you mentioned, the knowledge that has been lost. And so I often prefer to put myself in a position where I haven't learned anything. I haven't taught myself about a certain thing, and I go out there and I explore these ideas. That's been the case very much.
That has to be quite deadly, though, surely.
I don't know. Well,
not yet.
I don't know. I really haven't had a really bad experience. I mean, I've been in situations where I got concerned or whatever, but the human body, I mean, we really don't go to our limits. Most of us don't. We can go a lot farther. Our comfort zones is what's limiting us. But I have done some, research through books, occasionally videos if I'm, researching a specific thing. I did attend my very first survival skills class this past weekend. And very first one.
It's a little late.
But it was good, and it really taught me the value of a teacher or having a mentor, because I was able.
I'm sure you probably told them a thing or two.
Struggled with. The least experienced person has something to offer. Even we can learn from everybody and anybody something if we're open to it. Now, what tends to happen is that when a person does reach a level of expertise or something, they kind of close themselves off to the little voices, those that that aren't famous or well known, but
sometimes they have a different perspective on things and look at things maybe from a different angle. I think there's a lot to be said about doing things the way you've done it and learning kind of your own way. And in my own personal way to try and relate to that, I guess with what I do in making drinking horns and hand carving them, when I taught myself to do that, I refused to research and look at how other people had done it because I wanted to develop my way of doing it.
Right.
So then, but also for a fact that no one then can copy me because it's my own personal way. I've taught myself, but also I really enjoyed going through the process of figuring it out, testing different stuff, what worked best. And I think that's what kind of stands me out from other people, is because it is my own method and I've developed it myself. It's not one that I've researched. I think there is a lot to be said about learning things that way.
You're absolutely correct. I think that's the most fantastic education. And a big part of learning is learning also how not to do something. Mm-hmm. If you just do it the way that you're supposed to, I think it's very limiting. You learn a lot from getting things wrong. Yes, it's very frustrating. It takes a lot of time, but you do learn something more thoroughly that way.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think this is such an interesting topic for me. I find it so fascinating. So I guess to relate to the Vikings, my first question is to pull it back to what you were saying about, needing good nutrition to kind of get that big, strong. Obviously, we have this stereotypical image of Vikings of these tall, broad-shouldered, strong, muscular men who kind of came over with their sort of double-headed axes and that very much typical image. I imagine that's not the case, maybe from your experience, in the these men, they will have been on a boat for weeks and weeks, and I can't imagine that that's necessarily how they would have looked.
Yeah, that's
I know you're laughing.
We could speculate on that, but you have to look at the genetics. No doubt they were really tough people. Mm-hmm. No doubt, living in a very harsh environment like that. It's truly where only the strong survive. In today's society, the weak survive just as well as the strong because of our modern technologies and modern medicine. Mm-hmm. You have extremely high level of cases of diabetes and things. And I think a lot of, if people lived long enough or were able to, despite being unhealthy, back in those days, those people would die off, that's just the natural selection, that process. Mm-hmm. And so the Vikings, I can only imagine they were very strong people. However, it takes a lot of calories to sustain a large body. Mm-hmm. Right.
That's what I was thinking. Also the toll that it must take on the body being on a ship for so long. I know, Mathias, you said earlier that you'd actually spent a couple of weeks on a Viking ship. I think you said before the show, something I never knew. How much food can you carry on that?
You can carry a decent amount of food on a Viking ship, depending on, of course, on the design. As far as I remember, the one I was sailing on, bear with me, I was like 3 or 4. As far as I remember, it was a replica of one of the smaller Roskilde ships from Denmark, and I'm actually trying to find exactly the one, because it is mentioned in this wonderful book. People always think that I have a beef against Neil Price because of my comments in his latest book. But one of the best books on the Viking Age is the Viking World, as we have it right here. And Neil Price was part of making that. So I think it was the Roskilde 6, if I remember correctly. So it's a shorter one, fairly broad. You have 2 rowers on each side. You have a decent space in the middle, and you have a decent loading capacity as well. That's one of the things with the Viking boats, that they had a pretty high loading capacity, and once we get up towards after sort of like the height of the Viking Age, with all the cool long ships and all that stuff, the cargo ships that they have, this one right here. So the article tells us in 1025, shipbuilders around Hedeby, that's southern Denmark, produced much larger vessels, as the 25-meter long Hedeby 3 ship shows. Calculations indicate that it could carry approximately 60 tons. That's a lot. That's a lot for like 60 tons. So just keep that in mind. Actually, these ships could carry a decent amount of weight. Of course, that would include people and all that stuff.
I imagine a group of people. Well, let's say there's 100 men on the ship, 80 people on the ship. How many would we be looking at?
So the largest ship, as far as I remember, that would be the Skullerlev 2, which would be able to carry around 70 people.
Okay.
Right?
So 70 people for a couple of weeks. I imagine they go through a lot of food, though.
Right, and so we have a picture of it right here. Those ones are pretty. Can you see that one? Those ones are pretty narrow. That's a warship. It is designed for war and not for carrying a lot of bulk goods and all that stuff. They would have had to have carrier ships, cogs of some kind, or whatever you want to call them. Snekke is a Scandinavian word, I think, with them, cargo ships. So that's something to keep in mind too, that a fleet of like warriors from Scandinavia bound for the English coast would include several of these warships, right, of probably varying sizes, and then a whole train of probably cargo ships as well. Also, because you want to be able to bring in all the loot back home, right? Mm-hmm. And that would be probably the only, or at least the primary sort of strategic advantage these Vikings had, that they could take all of the loot, put it on a ship, and just push it offshore instead of having to transport it over land, and that way they could move around much faster. So yeah, those are some of the things to take into consideration with that.
But I imagine you couldn't access the cargo whilst at sea, or
that really depends on how.
If it was on a different cargo ship.
Yeah, so I am not an expert in in how you manage your cargo ships at sea when you're a Viking, but I could theorize, for instance, that you could have them attached to each other with ropes. Like, for instance, you could have one supply ship for one warship, and there could be like a rope attached to it. That's a possibility. I don't know if that's feasible. There could be perhaps some navigation issues with that. But that is a possibility that's how that could have worked out. Of course, this is hardly a safe science, right? Doing like basically transporting yourself across the North Sea back then would have been incredibly dangerous, right? You could run into a storm at any time, and you could navigate wrong, miss your mark, basically, find yourself in an entirely different portion of the British Isles, or maybe even not at all the British Isles, right? That there could be a lot of variables here that could actually set you off course and really throw a wrench in your gears here. So that's also something to take into consideration. So when you're like transporting multiple ships, and one ship is the one that's supposed to carry your food or other things that you need, you could lose that very easily as well. So that's a real risk as well.
Yeah, if you turned up and your cargo didn't, I imagine that would be a nightmare situation where Chad would thrive. So Chad, you said before that you've done a little bit of seafaring, I think. I'm really interested in like just the toll that being at sea for any long period of time would have on the human body. I imagine it can't be easy, even if you had enough food. I still imagine it must just be an awful situation to be in.
Well, it depends on other factors such as weather. The longest I've actually been on a boat at one time was 2 days. Fishing as a child, I used to go fishing a lot out in the ocean, and so it was typically fairly calm seas. Never was out there when it was very rough. I used to get seasick often until I eventually got used to it. The body naturally would just get used to it, and then it wouldn't be a problem anymore. But it was, I do remember getting off the boat. You still would be like this on land. You couldn't really stand straight. You're like, you know. Okay. So I imagine after being on a ship for 2 or 3 weeks, that would be pretty severe. They might be walking like that for a week.
Yeah, probably.
But I mean, the modern boats are very different from the boats that they had back then, I'm sure. And I imagine the sleeping accommodations were probably less comfortable. So the biggest factors would really be the weather, because if you get into rough seas, there's always the danger of capsizing or being set off course, as you mentioned, Matthias. But that would certainly take a toll, on the body, no doubt about it.
I also imagine just getting wet.
Yes,
just being wet would be horrible.
Exposure, the exposure to the elements really makes a huge, profound impact on your body. It's like it just sucks away your energy. I've experienced that just being outdoors, just being outside where you're exposed to the wind and the sun, or the rain, the humidity, whatever it is. Do that all day versus being indoors. If you're indoors, protected from all that, you really don't suffer nearly as much.
There's something about that, especially in Scandinavia and with all the rain that we get. Like, you just get angry. You start snapping at each other, and it's just like,
it's just miserable.
Yeah, I haven't been over in Europe before, but I've been to Alaska. And Southeast Alaska, in the summertime, it rains almost every day. And what you mentioned that really reminds me of hiking with a friend of mine in the mountains there. And it was just this constant drizzle, and he was getting so mad and cursing, and he was so upset with it, because you just get, everything is just wet and it gets heavier, and it's annoying. We're not fish. We're not designed made to be in the water, and be constantly wet. So it definitely takes a toll on us.
That's my Swedish hiking and canoeing experience right there.
Well, that's exactly what I'm thinking. This, you've got a bunch of guys all on a ship crossing the sea. Even if it's nice weather, I imagine you're still going to get wet from waves splashing over. And it must just get irritable, and they must have had like fights breaking out. Just having that, like you say, that exposure outside. I imagine sleeping conditions aren't going to be the best. It must just be a miserable time.
Absolutely. So a couple of things in terms of like technology. What did they have to sort of guard themselves from the weather and all that stuff? We know from some literature that they would cover the boats with hides, ox hide typically, At least that's according to a couple of sources. And aside from that, we also know that they would wear clothing made of, and I believe the English word is frieze. So this is this is, I don't know how to describe it properly. But it's a type of tight packed, as far as I remember, tight packed wool clothing that has been weatherproofed with some kind of fat, as far as I remember.
I bet it's heavy.
Yeah, it's really heavy, and that's again a problem that you didn't have, that you're carrying around several extra pounds, right? Mm-hmm. So yeah. And but it would protect you from the environments, and I'm sure that some leather, some kind of leather outfit would also have been used as well. So, and
I think it's safe to remember that they were probably more used to it than we are. If you put me on the ship for 2 weeks, I'd just be sat underneath a chair, probably crying. Whereas for them, I guess they didn't have the modern comforts that we have, so it was a little more bearable, I imagine, or normal.
Well, yeah, and another thing is also you would do it at a certain time of year. So in Scandinavian, April is the sailing month. So that's when you do this, right? You sail to England and raid England in April. That's when it starts, because that's the most comfortable time to do it.
Wouldn't they want to do it at a more unexpected time, though, as a surprise attack?
I think sometimes. Cost benefit analysis. I think you'd probably be like, nah, not in December.
No, December.
I can't stop thinking about how uncomfortable it would be just with a bunch of like I like my friends, but if you left me alone with them for 2 weeks, I know for a fact there's a few of them I'd want to throttle. So I imagine that must be the situation, especially when it's you imagine it's probably going to be quite hot-headed, sort of more violent type. It must just break out into some sort of fisticuffs.
That was common, yeah.
Yeah, you can probably assume that, but on the other hand, that is also why humans have come up with warrior rituals and all the mythology around being a warrior in and of itself. That's part of also tempering you as a warrior when you are in those very annoying situations where you just have to march for several hundred miles that way, or sit on a ship for several weeks, right?
Mm-hmm.
Those rituals that would have preceded becoming a warrior in different ways, apart from also partaking in battles with one another, would be part of also building up a group discipline that would restrain some of that.
Mm-hmm.
I would suggest, at least.
Yeah, I think we've probably, as well, in modern times, we've become less able to kind of be alone with ourselves, and we're never bored, really. Even though we say I'm bored, you've always got your phone or there's Netflix or something to watch. Whereas I'm sure they would have much more easily be able to walk for 10 miles in their own head, and it wasn't an issue because that's just how it was. You didn't have all these modern things to distract you and you keep you from.
We had a power outage up here yesterday for an hour, and I was like, who am I? What am I supposed to do with myself? So yeah, something has really happened to us lately.
Absolutely. So Chad, when, let's say, you have a Viking ship full of soldiers, warriors, and when they get to the English coast, if it was the first time they ever arrived and there wasn't a camp already set up, what's the first thing that you would do in a foreign land that you don't know, you don't understand? how on earth do you start to even make that situation beneficial for yourself, but survive and then also thrive and make an inhabitant there in a little civilization?
Well, what's the motive for going there, first of all?
It's well, it would be for raiding, but also, Matthias, would it be for they did want to settle and create long-term farms?
Probably, yeah. I mean, this is a really interesting question in and of itself, because we have these people that come from Scandinavia. They're of course familiar with the flora and fauna of Scandinavia. Then they migrate a lot of different places, right? To migrate to inland Russia. They migrate to the British Isles. They migrate to Iceland, which is presumably uninhabited when they get there. They migrate to Greenland, which is also uninhabited when they get there. That part of Greenland, at least. And then they even come to North America as well. And in all of these instances, they would have been partially there to find resources, partially there perhaps even to hunt specific resources. There are indications that the migrations across the North Atlantic actually came as a result of hunting walrus, because the walrus tusks, ivory, was incredibly important to the European market at the times. But when they were doing that, right, then some of them then seem to be staying behind, establishing farms, trade posts, all that stuff. In the English area, we have definitely the intention to raid and then leave. And then later on, the intention to stay as well.
Mm-hmm.
So it's different levels too. Possibly because some of the first ones that just came there for raiding perhaps even decided to stay. Who knows?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I would imagine that, I mean, the priorities vary based on the needs, which can be affected by the weather and just simply the landscape. If those areas have quite a bit of water, whereas where I live here in Southern California, water is a little more hard to come by. We have a warmer climate, which it makes having a warm shelter less important here than in Scandinavia.
Mm-hmm.
So I would imagine that they probably had skins and stuff that they could, materials that they could set up a very quick shelter to just to get started. They would set out if they have food still with them when they arrive, they would rely on that initially, but immediately they would start combing the landscape and identifying plants that they're familiar with, keeping their eye open for animals, tracks. They'd be searching, following tracks and trying to identify what kind of animals those may be. They'd be on the coast. And so the coast is always a rich place to find food, mollusks, clams. There's all kinds of stuff that grow right there in the tidal zone that they can eat. Algae, sea algae is very nutritious. And just about all of it's edible.
Mm-hmm.
And then fishing, I'm sure they had fishing equipment, lines and hooks and weights, and they would start doing that. And they would find very much similar fish because it's not that far away.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like another ocean. So they would, you would start with a simple shelter, and then as you're finding food and supplies, your resources, you would build.
Mm-hmm.
You would build a more permanent structure and several of them, and whatever other maybe like a barn or something to store food, and maybe they bring livestock with them too, right?
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So that's. Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, is that something that there was a case? Would they bring their own livestock with them, or would they rely on being able to find it, I guess, where they were going?
They would definitely, for the purposeful colonization efforts, bring livestock and maybe even grain storages and stuff like that with them. Perhaps butter, a yogurt in the form of skyr, as it is called in Icelandic, the thing they sell at Whole Foods here in the U.S., along with coconut water. They would bring that stuff with them, except the coconut water. They wouldn't have that. To places like Iceland, and judging from the stories that we have, right, of what happens next, apart from a very ritualized experience where they would actually take land, following a ritual that involved the gods and all that stuff. I mean, we don't actually know if they did that. That's just what the later stories are telling us, of course. Mm-hmm. They would build a house, right? They would probably be living in tents first. You could use the sail from the Viking ship as a tent. You could maybe even use the boat itself as some kind of shelter. Mind you, these boats are pretty light in a certain way. We know that in Russia, when they were moving through the river systems, they would drag them between rivers. So that's something that they would be familiar with too. And of course, what we realize from the early settlement stories in Iceland is that it's cold. It's a pretty rough environment, even for a Norwegian farmer. This is one of the first stories. The famous Floki, whom we know from Vikings, who went there and settled. He's the first to realize this is a really cold place, and he actually has to abandon his settlement because his cattle die because he hasn't collected enough feed. So that right there, you have a environmental realization that some of the first settlers did. Of course, we don't know if it was a man named Floki. We just know that this is something they found out as one of the first things when they came to Iceland. Mm-hmm. So what they would do is that very quickly they would probably have built that house structure that they needed, a communal house, those long houses that we know from popular visions of Vikings. Then that would be an interior structure of wood with I'm not entirely sure if they would use interlaced like branches with clay on them in Iceland, but they would definitely use turf, right? So cutting out pieces of that, it's called turf, right, in English?
Yeah.
Yeah. Cutting out pieces of top layer of soil held together by grass, and then stacking that on the outside of the wood structure, and that would then insulate from the cold climate. And then if they brought livestock, right, part of it would be exactly what Mike has found for us right there.
Oh wow!
If they had brought
people pay a lot of money for that now. It's very on fleek.
And if they brought livestock in that situation, right? I think actually, some of the last Icelanders to live in houses like that, that's like only a couple of generations ago. And some of my Icelandic friends have told me over the years that their grandparents would live in houses that didn't have floors and stuff like that, and out in small farms. So yeah. They would make sure to start collecting feed basically by harvesting, cutting the naturally growing grass around the area in the pastures, and make sure to stack that in a barn that they would also have built. So that would be probably sort of the main sort of broad spectrum processes that would happen first when you got there in the North Atlantic.
That can't be a quick process. Just pop. I know you said they built a barn, they built a longhouse. It's like that must take some time. They're not simple, easy, kind of quick structures. They must take some knowledge. So you have to, I guess, survive off the land before you can get your animals grazing, get everything built. You must have some understanding of what you can eat naturally, and you're feeding quite a few people. And that just absolutely fascinates me. But as I sit here and I'm kind of thinking internally, I'm kind of thinking probably how much of an anomaly Chad is in modern day to people who have no idea of the things that he knows, whereas it was probably the other way around back then. The people like me that know absolutely nothing of this were probably a rarity, and we starved and died, whereas everybody probably had the knowledge that Chad had. It was like one of these things that I imagine was just passed down from generation to generation because it was so important, whereas maybe it's not as important now because, like we said before, you have mod cons to survive.
So we can also compare with some other scenarios, right? One of the things that I'm familiar with through what I teach is, of course, what I like to call British gentlemen bumbling around in the Arctic. There are some fascinating stories about typically British military guys, right? Franklin is one of the famous ones. Who goes to the Arctic in two ships and disappears, and everybody ends up eating each other, and I don't know what. That's a great example of how you don't survive, right, in a harsh environment. There are other examples of similar situations where we have explorations in the Barren Grounds in what is now Canada. Where the logs that they've kept give us a really good sort of insight into all the mistakes they make, right? And this is 200, 150 years ago. And what we always see is, of course, that those who have grown up with survival experiences of various kinds and basic learning of techniques of various kinds, that in these cases would be Native Americans that are with them on these trips. They're the ones who survive, right? Whereas you have these British officers eating their shoes. The Iroquois guy that they brought with them, he's like out hunting and, that kind of stuff.
So Chad, one thing I wanted to ask is how much this do you think is innate? Because obviously you're out, you've been out in some situations where you've had to rely on yourself to figure stuff out, what you can eat, what you can't eat. And I guess back in the Viking age, some of it will have been passed down. But do you think some of it is just, it's kind of passed down through maybe genealogy, I guess, and you just know instinctively what you can eat, what you can't eat, what you should do, what you shouldn't do? Because I've never really been in that position where I've had to rely on myself to figure it out. I'd just pick the first berry up and try it, and it probably would go terribly wrong.
I'm sure people did that too and died. And, when they saw Billy lying on the ground next to that poisonous bush, they put two and two together. Maybe we should avoid that. But this was how people lived all the time. Now, today we have so many different career paths and types of studies, in school and all these different subjects and stuff. Back then, kids were learning survival skills at a very young age. They didn't have cell phones and Minecraft and things like that to occupy their time, which was really
ambitious parents.
The parents were probably very strict, and they would accompany the parents out on, collecting food or whatever, or taking care of the livestock. I mean, this is stuff they learned at a very young age, which today's millennials wouldn't dare do anything like that, for the most part. So today's kids, they grew up with almost zero survival skills. And they learn to just rely on society, get a job and be told what to do. Whereas, back then they were very much more self-sufficient. But going to a new place, obviously, they would encounter plants and animals and other dangers that they weren't familiar with. But there is a way to safely, more or less safely, experiment and sample.
Get someone else to try it first.
Well, that's one way. That's the quickest way to figure it out. And
Convince your friend or your enemy.
Exactly. I'm sure people did that, and just to observe the results, But for instance, if you encounter a plant you're not familiar with, you can there's a simple test where you just simply increase your exposure to it. First you touch it, and it takes a few days to really correctly do it. But by touching the plant, you observe if there's any kind of reaction on your skin. Then you might apply the plant, break it open and rub the leaf on a more sensitive area, such as the wrist or your inner arm. And you wait to see if there's a reaction. If there's a reaction, then you're not going to eat it, right? Then you can touch it to your lips and observe if there's a reaction. Put it on your tongue. Is there a reaction? Chew a little bit, spit it out. Is there a reaction? Then taste, actually swallow a tiny bit and see if there's a reaction. Now, granted, this you can't test several plants at the same time, because if you do and you have a reaction, you won't know which one caused the reaction. So that's why it's a very slow process. But eventually, and I've done this with unknown plants. I've eaten several plants that I didn't know. And I have determined that, not always, but in most cases, they were edible. I have eaten a few poisonous plants. In most cases, a toxic plant is just going to cause indigestion. It's going to give you diarrhea or something like that. That's.
I imagine that that's not good at the best of times. But when you're out somewhere on your own in a harsh environment, I imagine that's 10 times worse.
It can be deadly. Because you suffer dehydration then, and it can be the thing that breaks you. Mushrooms, however, can be more dangerous, because if you make a mistake with mushrooms, it can be very deadly very quickly. And there's mushrooms are a little more tricky. But
I imagine that mushrooms is probably something you'd have quite a lot of in England as well, where they've been such a moist, a moist climate. They would be abundance. I mean, I've never been a fan of mushrooms. There's something about the taste, but the texture of them for me. This is my spoiled modern self coming out. It's like that texture is just a little too off-putting for me. But I guess if I had nothing else to eat, then of course I would have to have a go.
Yeah. But plants, however, are not a very good source of calories. You're not gonna meet your nutritional needs by eating leaves. Roots are good, and seeds or nuts.
You've just upset so many vegetarians right there.
I'm sure. I've made that point out before, because I've gone to places, with very limited food, and I end up, scavenging for things to eat, and and I've lost a lot of weight and strength, very quickly, just eating plants. And, eventually you can just be so weak that, you're not able to really function properly. So animals are definitely the best source then. And that's why, virtually possibly every culture, maybe not everyone, but most of them relied on animals as a source of food. You kill one squirrel, you get a lot. It can feed you for a day. It'll sustain you not too bad. Or a rabbit. But leaves will never provide enough nutrients. There's just not enough protein and fat. Protein and fat is the best source of nutrition for.
And when we
situations.
When we get into the regions that you go and survive in, I imagine that various kinds of insects and larvae are good sources of protein, right? And
absolutely.
In general.
Many cultures and even today they eat a lot of insects. I've eaten a lot of live insects typically. And there's a little danger in that. I've been warned because of parasites, but I've never had a problem. But I've eaten a lot of grasshoppers, ants, finding an anthill in the desert and just smashing them and then eating them.
Wow. That's insane to me.
it's a readily available source of protein and fat, and they're very nutritious.
Yeah.
And healthy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so in Scandinavia and in the North Atlantic in general, I wouldn't go for insects that much, but because they're quite small generally. I would
They
say.
are the small.
Good. That's how we like it.
Yeah.
We like them that way.
But fish, right? Fish is the thing that a Viking would survive on. I'm sure in this journey across the North Atlantic in different ways, right? You start in Norway. Let's say Norway. You start there by already having caught a bunch of fish. You dried them so that they preserve longer, and maybe you've even also fermented some sheep's meat or something like that, so that you can preserve that for a journey. And then you're fishing along the way, regardless of where you're going. Right, that's one of the main things that you would always be doing. We have some examples, right, of cuisine, curious cuisine, North Atlantic cuisine that has come out of probably survival situations. And going back to this thing of like figuring out if something is poisonous, right? The Greenlandic shark that is being eaten in Iceland, it needs to ferment for about 3 months or so. Because it stores ammonia in its muscle tissue.
Interesting.
Yes. So right there, you have that trial and error scenario where somebody has been like, hey, Olaf, try this for a bit. And Olaf died. Well, next one, right? And so they found out that the fermentation period is about 3 months, and then you have to hang it a little bit too, and then you can eat it, right? You have similar things with fermented sheep, as I mentioned, or buried sheep as well. So, put a sheep in the ground, let it lie there for some time. When we go to Inuit cultures in Greenland and Arctic Canada, then we find gibiak as a particular interesting type of food, where you take birds and put them into a sealskin that has the fat on the inside. So you're basically just taking the skin off without taking off the fat. Then you sew that into a bag, and then you put that in the shade, some nice and cool place for a month or so.
Wow.
And then you can take those fermented birds out again and eat them. Of course,
there seems to be a lot of fermenting going on.
Yeah, because so what we're dealing with here is a climate where those kinds of things work a little better than the hotter climates. So that's one aspect of it. Aside from that, that is the way that you increase the longevity of sustenance in different ways,
Exactly.
right? So, but always you would be focused, I'm sure, on fishing and also hunting grounds. One interesting thing that we see in Greenland with these Scandinavian pastoralists and peasants is really what they are when they come there, right? Is that over time, from the colonization happens in the late 900s, and so the community dies out in somewhere in the mid 1400s. And over that period of time, the climate gets harsher. And we can also see from their trash heaps and stuff like that, that they have gone or pivoted more and more towards hunted animals, which tells us then that their agricultural skills were failing in a climate that was getting colder. And they were resorting to fishing and hunting more. So that's something to consider as well. Sometimes you have to simply shift in another direction than the things that you've learned, because otherwise you can't survive. We also have an interesting example of the story of the Vikings that go to Vinland, to North America, that they're starving at one point, and then they find a whale. Actually, the story goes that this guy goes up on a mountaintop, and then he lies there under a cover for 3 days, I think it is, and then he comes back, and then there's a beached whale, and then they eat the whale, and then they get sick, and he reveals that he had been praying to Thor, I think it was, to get it, and there's a whole like. There's a little thing about Christianity in there as well. The Christian crew are like, no, we can't do that. And then this guy runs off with the pagans to the north, as it says. But what we're told here is that they eat this whale and then they get sick from the meat, which is, of course, again, some kind of lesson about the environment as well, and about finding animals like that and what do you do with them. Iceland has had plenty of laws when it comes to what you can and cannot do with beached whales, who owns it, and all that stuff. And that tells you, again, a beached whale would then also be a useful source of food for whoever finds it, right?
Mm-hmm.
I imagine that feeds a lot of people as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
One thing I
don't die from it because it's like poisonous or something.
I think one thing is people probably look to food differently as well. Obviously, in modern times, we have very much a pleasure-based link with food. Or no, I certainly do. I eat because I like the taste of it. Whereas I imagine it was very much survival-based, and so it didn't necessarily matter what it was, as long as you were getting that nutritional value to survive. Chad, I imagine some of the bugs you've eaten aren't the nicest.
I over the years, I've become very self-controlled with diet. Many of the things that people find very tasty and delightful, I turn away from, sugars and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
So I have very little temptation with any of that. But like you had mentioned before, if you weren't exposed to McDonald's or, Chinese restaurants and all that stuff, because it just didn't exist then, you only knew, maybe 24 different food items. That's all you knew. You go to the supermarket today and there's hundreds and thousands of choices,
Mm-hmm.
So you wouldn't have had the chance or opportunity to create this food addiction, that we have today. But, meats cooked in the fat is very tasty. It is very tasty.
Yeah.
It was then, and it is today, so I think that was the main source of food. And people today, I have friends that are carnivores that have switched to only eating animals, and they feel better. They have better health as a result. There's numerous people that have done that.
Mm-hmm.
They're going back to that, and that's very much the way, especially in those northern latitudes where there's not a lot of plant life growing. Especially through the winter. You had mentioned the fermentation, which that's fascinating, and that's been done throughout the world. Even in tropical climates, fermentation was cassava.
Right? Yeah.
Had to be fermented in order to make it safe to eat, and the process to discovering that is it's absolutely that. Someone tried something, it's like, eating raw cassava, first of all, is not tasty. It doesn't. Our taste buds do give us an indication of something that's good or not, for a lot of things. I mean, obviously not like a chili pepper or garlic, which are kind of strong tasting. You might think that they're poisonous at first, and I'm sure just through trial and error, experimentation and observing what happens. I mean, I guarantee there are a lot of people that ate things and died, and the rest of the population around them, friends or people, they observed that, and others that became terribly ill and they survived, and you learn your lesson through that. And all this information is just passed from generation to generation. I mean, obviously those were super important things, as we were talking about earlier, how today's children, or most people today wouldn't be able to identify the poisonous plants in their landscape. But then everybody knew it was crucial for their survival. So it was common knowledge then.
Mhm.
Yeah, I have a good, funny story about this. A friend of mine told me about a time when he was working in, I believe it was Angola, in a village, and they were having this gathering that was happening, and he was standing there in the outskirts of the gathering, and then he started like leaning his hand against the tree, and then all the kids start laughing at him and pointing and all that stuff, and he's like, wait, what's wrong here? And the way that I remember it, and I might be remembering it wrong, but what he told me was that the reason that they were all laughing at him is because there's like some kind of like poisonous spider or other animal living in particularly in the vines that grow around that tree, and so everybody knows basically to stay away from it, and they're that one standing there leaning against it. So,
Nice of them to tell him.
Yeah, right. Well, they laughed at him. That's the way to tell him.
So that's a good segue into what I wanted to ask next, which was, I guess, like medicine. And Chad, I imagine you've been in some pretty sticky situations at some point, or where things aren't necessarily going your way, and you have to survive. And the human body is a tough thing. How much of it can you just figure out? When it comes to medicine, are you able to know what's going to help, what's not going to help, what you need to do? Like, how does that work?
The medicine, that's a whole nother topic. I really haven't pondered that very much. Me personally, I've never really used any medicine out in nature, that I've collected or anything like that. I mean, I've taken plants that are considered medicinal, as a tea, just for the heck of it, but not to particularly treat anything. And I would suspect that was probably quite common to regularly take medicinal teas, perhaps, or other plants, just as kind of your daily maintenance, or weekly or whatever, just because it was probably, you want to prevent an illness. Prevention, I think, would have been very important, because if you get something, then overcoming it could be very difficult. So I think prevention, that's how I tend to think about it when I'm out there. But trying to, I don't think they really had a way to determine if something actually worked medicinally. It'd be really hard. I mean, if you think about it, because in most cases, if you get sick, if you just wait, you give it enough time, your body heals, And so a lot of times people take a medicine, or they'll take a herbal remedy or something, and they get better, and they owe it all to the medicine. But did the medicine really do anything? Because if you don't do anything, most likely you're going to recover. You get a cold or something. I mean, I've had dozens and dozens of colds throughout my life. But I do feel that there are certain things that help me to overcome them. This could be a good example, because I know when I was younger, I frequently would get colds, throughout maybe a few times through the year. It was normal. But as I got older and I heard about different things such as garlic, I learned about garlic and heard that it's very good for, boosting the immune system, antibiotic or whatever. And so I started using garlic at the beginning of where I would start feeling a little ill. I might feel a little bit of runny nose or something, and I would start eating a lot of garlic. And almost every time it would stop. It would stop the cold from getting any worse. And within sometimes hours, or by the next day, I'd be fine. And so yeah, I think it could be experimenting like that. And generally bitter things that are very bitter, tend to be medicinal, such as garlic or onions, chili peppers. There's a ton of herbal leaves, that are very bitter. Certain seeds, cloves, they're very strong. not necessarily bitter, but very strong in flavor or scent. And those tend to be the more medicinal plants in many cases.
So have you ever I was going to say, you ever been in a situation where you've really kind of worried for yourself or been ill or hurt? So I was wondering just on that mindset of what you do, whether you think I need to try and find something to help heal myself, or do you just think I need to take cover and recuperate, or how that works?
The only times that happened to me was in Mexico in a tropical, almost jungle area. And let's see, one time, actually 2 times, I think I had a bit of dysentery, perhaps from the water. And it caused some diarrhea. It was mild. And with that, it wasn't bad enough to really stop me. So I wasn't thinking about treating it. I ate less, and just, I just endured it. It wasn't a big deal. Again, it was mild. Another time, suddenly my lower back just went out. I was in terrible pain, and bending over was very painful. And in that case, I just had to compensate. I had to, just improvise and just tough it out. And I have found that I call it survival mode. It seems like something happens to the body when you are in a situation where it's starting to get a little quite very uncomfortable or perhaps dangerous. Your body, the adrenaline or whatever it might be. But I have found that, I've walked barefoot out of that same jungle for several miles a couple of years ago. And, but once I got to civilization, that's when it just hits you and you feel it and you're just exhausted and your body just starts to hurt so much all over. But it's after you get out of the situation that your body relaxes and it kind of gives in, and so that's what I refer that to survival mode, because I experienced that so many times where it's you're just giving your all. I haven't eaten for 2 days and barely any sleep, and I'm just amazed that I'm able to keep going. But as soon as I get back to the vehicle or I get back to the city, then it hits me and I'm just destroyed.
Yeah, I bet.
Sleep.
So I just want to go back to this thing about garlic. Just fun fact, in the medieval period in Europe, garlic was the thing that people used to improve their breath. Just wouldn't you believe that?
Really?
Yes. So chewing on garlic was simply a thing that you did to overcome the stench of your mouth.
That says a lot about how bad your breath must have been.
Right.
Yeah. Right.
But there's another aspect to it, right? So of course, people had their teeth would rot. They would be eating things that slowly over time would of course take their toll on the teeth, and you would have a rotten tooth, and you wouldn't necessarily be able to just pull it out, and so on. And there are antiseptic qualities to garlic, and so that's one of the things that people would be eating to sort of try to relieve that. And I think it helped, at least to an extent. The same with when it comes to Northern Europe, honey is another antiseptic agent in its raw form, at least, that would be helpful. And there's honey does feature as an important element in mythology from Northern Europe and Europe in general. So that's definitely 2 things, garlic and honey, that would be probably both available to Vikings, but definitely a little later on in the medieval period that they would be using a lot. So that's definitely 2 things that, yeah.
I do love the smell of wild garlic as well. There's
Right.
There's something about it. I wonder whether that's kind of like a natural thing of just This smells good.
Yeah, there's a certain type of wild growing onion in Denmark that in April, Northern Europe, not just Denmark, but I've experienced it in Denmark. That around April it just makes the entire forest smell like onion. You're like, whoa.
Here too.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a very localized, very small demographical area for this onion. It's called early onion. It comes up in April, May, and yeah, it just smells so wonderful. You're just walking through that area. It's actually where I have my hut. It grows all around there.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Oh, nice. Yeah, I mean, I find this topic so interesting. Just trying to put your mindset into how these people would have been, because I think it's easy when we do these episodes and we speak about just the factual based events to forget that there were real people, but also just look at the event in itself and not think about how they would have lived and thought and acted and reacted to things. And it's such a fascinating topic for me to try and literally put myself in that mindset, because we are so different now and we've changed so much, to try and strip that away and look at it from their perspective, so you can kind of learn and see how they saw things and hopefully understand the mythology better and what you want to learn about the Viking Age better as well.
Yeah. There's something that's actually striking me here in terms of like how we think about people in the past. And that comes from the fact that my dog ran into a tree yesterday. It was quite hilarious. Just they came bolting and couldn't stop, and then boom. and that made me think of cats that fall off everything all the time, right? We have like this. You just think about a cat, right? Like, it's so many times the cat fails at whatever it's trying to do, and then you have one of those. If you manage to film it, then you have something that you can share on social media, and it might go viral, right? I'm just thinking about it. So we have this tendency to think about animals like these fine-tuned machines that can just like go until one day they drop dead, right? And I think sometimes we make. I mean, I think that's not the appropriate way to always think about animals. In the same way, humans in the past. I mean, there's been a lot of people screwing up for us to get to the point where we are at now, right? And thankfully, for in many cases, that screwing up hasn't necessarily like been so detrimental that they died and couldn't reproduce. Or maybe they died later, but I just wanted to like throw it out there that there is also, a lot to be said for half-assing it in different ways, right? There's a lot of people in history who have half-assed it too, with their survival skills in different ways, and just made it, so that they could reproduce, and then down the line, here I am, right? That kind of stuff.
I think the way that people looked at things would have been completely different. I guess the most obvious one is the modern relationship to meat, and how a lot of people look at meat, and even a lot of people who eat meat but wouldn't be willing to kill the animal themselves, or wouldn't even want to watch the animal being killed. Whereas back then it would have just been part of it. You trapped the animal, you killed it, you butchered
another
it.
Thing,
and you ate it.
Sorry to interrupt here, but also another thing, the meat that people eat nowadays, I mean, that's an entirely different thing from what it means to eat an animal. Like, when I was a kid in Greenland, there's like several parts of an animal that you would eat raw, right? Such things as liver, the fat from the seal. I hated that. You take a bite of that fat and it just melt in your mouth, and it was the most disgusting thing ever. But on the other hand,
who even are you? We've done 50 odd episodes of this, and I feel like I don't know you. I'm finding things out about you.
One thing that I would love, on the other hand, that I still love, I get hungry just thinking about it, is seal soup or raw whale skin. You chew on that, and that's something that you just go chew on. I mean, popularly, it's called Greenlandic gum, right? Because it
I
takes
would
a while
love to try
get
that.
through.
I would love to try that.
It's one of the most delicious things, in my opinion. But of course, like a lot of people, when I teach subjects on the Arctic in my classes, I show pictures of this to give my students a sense of like, what is the difference between the life that you're living here in comfortable continental America, as opposed to what is the type of life that has traditionally played out in the Arctic, and is still in different ways playing out. And the disgust on their faces is quite obvious sometimes when I show them these pictures of that kind of food, right? Because it's so far from the imagination. Like, we think of meat as like this nice red piece of beef that you get, right?
Well,
that's really
it's in a nice packet with a bit of cellophane over the top, and doesn't look like the animal that has been anthropomorphized. I can't even say the word. Anthropomorphized. Something. Everyone knows the word. It's the one we can't pronounce. But there's been that word in kind of Disney and on TV and in films, and made very human-like. Yeah. And so people have an attachment to the animals. So what you get when it gets to eat, it doesn't look like it did then. So you kind of have this removal from it, whereas it would have been very much just the normal thing, I guess, back there. And I imagine you've probably done this yourself, Chad. You've set a trap, you've caught something, you've had to kill it, eat it, and that's just the way it is. That's how you had to do it to survive.
I ate Simba of the Lion King. I haven't done a lot of trapping, but I've done a lot of fishing. I've hunted some animals, a rattlesnake. It wasn't like I had to do it to survive, but it's just, I mean, here it's more, you're doing it to practice those skills. Mm-hmm. But fishing and all that, and so I can understand, because as a child, growing up in this culture and society here, I remember I learned that it's best to kill the fish completely as quickly as possible, because if it stayed alive, I would eventually want to throw it back. It's like, wow, this one's tough. You start, you have this kind of bond or attachment to it, mm-hmm. because it's alive. It's almost like it's becoming your pet. It's in the bucket or it's on the stringer or something, but it's not, it's still swimming around, and you start to feel remorse for it and then want to throw it back.
When I was sorry, this is going to make me sound like a psycho, but when I was a kid and we had caught the fish in Greenland, we would make sure to keep them alive as long as possible, so that we could cut the heart out and then have it like throbbing in your hand.
Wow.
that was our thing. I think you get a different perspective on these kinds of things.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
But that's, I mean, I'm sure some people listening to this, that probably sounds like absolute savagery, and it's something that they would never imagine doing. And I think even just that small difference, even in modern days, from yourself to, like I said, whoever's listening to it, just shows the differences that we must have now compared to how they would have been 1,000 years ago, and what they would have done, and what was just acceptable. And it wasn't that it's right or wrong, or good or bad. It was just how it was then, and things are different now. And I think people forget that, and they look back and go, oh, well, they were just really mean to animals or something like that. And it's like that just wasn't the case. It was just different.
Yeah. I mean, and this anthropomorphizing of
one of us will get there
of the animals. I mean, it's interesting to consider, because, like, on the other hand, As we're sitting here talking about food, I'm getting more and more hungry, and my mind is just like thinking about the things that I would like. And like one of the things I would really like to do is like go to Iceland and go straight to the bus station in Reykjavik, where the tourist bus station where they sell sheep's head. So you can get like half a boiled sheep's head with the mashed potatoes. It's one of the most delicious things in my opinion. And so many people won't read it, right? Because it's staring at you.
I've had goat head.
Yeah,
goat head. Yeah, it was at a Nigerian restaurant in Chicago, and it's prepared much the traditional way. They take the brain and they make a sauce out of the brain. And so you have this brain, mixed in there and all parts of the meat from the skull, everything, the eyes. And so you have these big eyes floating in there. And I tell you, the eyes were the tastiest part. They were the most delicious.
They are.
See, even to me, I'm like, that sounds so weird. But then my brain kicks in, and it's also, I'm a huge believer that if you ever kill an animal, you should make the absolute most of that. You should use every part of it. You should eat as much as you can. You should use as much as you can. You should have no waste. So it makes perfect sense that you would eat the head, eat the brains, the eyes. You eat it all, because at the end of the day, you might not know when you're next going to eat, or you might not know the next animal you're going to catch. But it still seems really weird to me.
Yeah, in today's culture. But there's a lot of nutrients that are specifically available in the organs that you don't find in the meat. And they're very important nutrients for optimal health. But yeah, even as I've learned all of this, I've come to where, just throwing away a piece of meat or any part of an animal, to me is very disgraceful. It's very disrespectful to the animal. And when you think about it, it's sacrificed its life. It's given its life up so that those that are eating it have life, to extend their life, right? For our nutrition. And to throw in the trash a piece of meat or fat or any part of an animal, and then it goes to the trash. That's I kind of think about it, we certainly wouldn't do that with our loved ones. They die and we just throw them in the dumpster, right? In a sense, that's what's happening with so much of our food or the animals, And so when I catch fish, for example, I'll use as much as possible, but the remains, it's going to either be buried in the ground, where it's going to, instead of going into a dump, with all this other trash, I think it needs to be utilized, so buried in the ground where it's going to provide nutrients, for plants and, further life, or even just in the ocean. But they used everything, the skins. The skins of, virtually every animal can be used. They can be used for something, into useful things, and the bones for tools. And there's just so much.
Yeah, I think fur is probably a really good example of this.
Yes.
And fur's a really tough one, because if you had a fur coat now, people would just look at you really negatively, really bad.
Right.
But there is areas in the world where bears have to be hunted, wolves have to be hunted, and this is just something that has to happen for conservation of other animals, and it's just something that happens. So surely those furs should be used and utilized rather than just thrown away or burned.
Absolutely.
And why I 100% believe that. But if I was to, I guess one of the main ones is with Canadian goose, they have the coyote. I think it's coyote fur around the hood, and a lot of people get angry about that.
What? Coyotes are everywhere.
Well, that's the thing. So a lot of coyotes have to be culled to look after, obviously, the climate. So people get really upset about it, and I think it's because they don't look at why it happens. They just get upset because this is so. You could have for example, you could hunt a wolf yourself for the right reasons, make a nice coat or jacket out of it, but nobody's gonna ask you where it came from before they attack you for wearing it, if that makes sense.
Throw red paint on you.
But that, yeah,
absolutely.
exactly. But it's all it's that kind of catch-22 situation where it's, well, unfortunately they have to die because of the situation humans have created, where we fucked with the ecosystem.
Mhm.
Unfortunately, we're now in a position where we have a responsibility to make sure we cull these animals. So what do you want to do? Do you want to just not use the meat? Do you want to just throw the fur away? So it is a really tough one. But also, I 100% don't believe in animals being bred just for their fur. I think that's just equally as disgusting as throwing away the fur from. So I think we've just put ourselves in a situation where no matter what you do, you're always wrong, or you're going to upset somebody.
That's the reality of life on Earth.
It is at the moment. It is at the moment for sure.
So to add to this, I mean, we have a situation where certain animals are kept in cages in like this industrial mass production of fur, and this is what we see, environmental organizations targeting, at least on the surface. But we also have situations where sustainable hunt happens. For instance, with the seal. I can tell you there's not a lot of Arctic peoples who have a lot of love for the environmental groups that are trying to ban or have succeeded in banning seal skin in the EU, for instance, and also I believe here in the US, because there are millions of certain types of seals at least, and there are very few peoples who are actually hunting them. When we go to Nunavut and Greenland as the two primary areas with populations that hunt seals, we're dealing with around 100,000 people, and not all of them, of course, hunt seals at all. So, when we talk about sustainability, the ability to maintain a seal population, as opposed to like hunting them for instance, their fur and such, it's not going to have a major impact on the population, the seal population as such. But those cute little seals, those pup-looking seals, right? Yeah,
they are very cute.
and that very bloody, gory harvesting method of like beating them with bats, right? That's the image that everybody has of
absolutely. That's what comes to my mind straight away. Though I feel like it was more. I saw it more when I was maybe like 10 years ago. Like that seal clubbing, you would see it kind of online on Facebook, and it spreads around, and then everyone gets really upset about it.
And that's industrial Canadian seal hunting that has nothing to do with indigenous seal hunting in the Arctic. That's from Labrador. So still the Arctic, but it's actually an industrial harvest that has nothing to do with the harvesting that happens among indigenous peoples in the Arctic. However, the seal banning is, of course, hurting the indigenous peoples in the Arctic, because all of a sudden they can't sell their goods, and that makes them poorer. So those are some of like these ambiguous conundrums that we're dealing with in this modern world when it comes to
tough, because there always will be somebody who exploits it, but there also will be good reasons to do things as well. I think the come away is that people are just shitter. That's my underlying takeaway, is that some humans are just really shitter. So I think we can wrap this one up. This has been fun. I feel like I've learned a lot.
Good, I've learned a lot. This has been great.
Yeah, it has. Yeah.
No,
I have a lot of admiration for your, just going out into tropical and desert climates and just surviving. I mean, I can do farther north, but not that stuff. That I would die immediately.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Every climate is so unique, and particularly the desert, just the dryness, the need for water.
Yeah, no, I mean, I I have a big love for the desert myself, especially in places like New Mexico and Arizona. But I mean, I always travel around with like a lot of water when I'm there.
Yeah, that's good. You need it.
Yeah.
Absolutely. No, I mean, yeah, I have a lot of admiration for you. I think it's important that people like you do what you do, because so much of the knowledge that you have will have been lost and you're having to relearn it, and hopefully through your videos you can pass it on to others and we can try and keep this alive, because more and more of it must be getting lost as generations go on, as we get, I like to think, softer. We just become
definitely softer. We are, but yeah, it becomes more and more challenging because as you're talking about, controlling the seal hunting. I mean, there's so many places where you're not even allowed to pick fruit or leaves. I mean, it's just there seems to be less and less opportunity every day to practice these sustainable survival skills. In a way, we're forcibly being disconnected from nature. There's just less and less opportunity legally to do it.
Yeah, exactly.
I imagine the places you are, there's not going to be many people with a watchful eye. Yeah,
I avoid people. My goal is to not see anybody where I go. And really, it's not doing harm. It's harvesting wild foods can benefit the natural environment. You could benefit a lot. The presence of man. I mean, there's areas that are overgrown with lots of dead brush and stuff, and what natives did is they would collect that and burn it, for their fires. But and when you clear that, it allows more new growth to appear, so it really helps nature when man does participate in the environment there. But what we've done is we've forbidden man to do that in many areas. And you mentioned overpopulation of certain species, that causes the imbalance. You can't hunt coyotes, and so the rabbit population is small and the coyotes are starving, and so there's all kinds of imbalances that happen as a result of man being forbidden to enter and take from nature. But it has to be done, in a responsible way.
Yeah, so that's it. I think we've created this situation we're in now, and it's not going anywhere. The cities aren't going anywhere. It's not going to change. So we have a responsibility to make sure we try and keep everything else as balanced as possible. And unfortunately, it's not just a case of we can just leave it alone and allow it to naturally do what it's going to do, because some things don't have predators anymore.
Yeah, exactly. We're very much a part of the fabric of nature, and it's interesting because you have nature and you have man. There's like this separation that we have in our culture, the wilderness and nature, and we separate ourselves from nature. We call, it's man-made, there's naturally made. And so there's this big wall between us, in our mindset, but it wasn't like that before, where humans were very much a part of nature and nature was a part of humans. That's how it was meant to be.
Well, we are. We
certainly still are, right? We're and the thing is that we're actually engaging more with nature in certain ways than we were back when we lived naturally, because we're encroaching upon so many spaces in nature, right? Through our resource extractions in different ways. We're going places and changing the environment and changing how the landscape looks and so on. That never happened before. Just think of strip mining or drilling for oil in the Arctic. Those kinds of things. That's like major changes, right?
Oh, so absolutely.
What we're basically doing is that we're engaging more with nature now than that hunter that would cross the ice to find an animal to eat and then go back home, right?
It's a much different motive. The motivation is more of greed, of taking, it's not giving back. Whereas before, man was nurturing more of nature.
I think they had more of an understanding that, more of an idea of sustainability. They knew if they had X amount of animals in an area, if they killed them all, then they were out of animals. So, but if you killed one or two and allowed them to repopulate, then you had a long-term source of food. So I think that idea of sustainability was there, whereas now it's take what you can, make as much money as you can, and get the fuck out. That's the unfortunate way that it seems to be.
Kind of what the Vikings also did actually in Greenland and in Iceland. They killed off the walrus population. You can sort of like follow their migrations based off of where the walrus once was, and then it dies off as they show up, and then they go farther and farther north.
In that case, some things never change.
Well, I mean, there was a financial incentive, right? This was to sell the ivory and use the skin for ropes and stuff like that. So yeah, it is the money incentive when that shows up.
Exactly.
Absolutely. Yeah. Sophie's just said that she loves survival stuff, but you make her feel like such a wimp. And I think I feel like that as well. You know, I'm this, I don't know what I weigh now, like 108 kilo ex-rugby player, decent sized human being. And then I'm like, you know, if I was out in the wild, I'd be so fucked. I just wouldn't. I imagine I would try and figure it out, but it's just it's knowledge. Knowledge means so much, I guess, when it comes to survival and being out there on your own.
Yeah, very much. Knowing what to do and knowing a lot about yourself, as I mentioned earlier, kind of knowing your limitations, your discomfort levels, you know, what you really need in order to stay healthy and strong.
Perfect. Yeah, no, let's wrap this up. Chad, do you want to give your YouTube channel a shout out, your Instagram, wherever anyone can find your work? Hopefully a bunch of people are going to come and watch your videos.
Yeah, on YouTube, if you just Google my name, Chad Zuber, that's with a Zuber, my channel will pop up. And on Instagram, Chad Zuber Official. And I'm pretty active on there. I try to respond to all the direct messages. I try my best.
It's hard work.
But, yeah,
it is.
Yeah.
I imagine you when you go out, do you tend to try and leave your phone? Do you leave it like at home, or do you keep it and take it with you just in case?
Or bring what? What's it?
Like your cell phone.
My phone. Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about that because I have been taking it, but you know, my goal, ideally, I want to be in places where I don't have cell phone reception anyway. So
okay,
ideally, but that's getting harder and harder to find these days. Cell phone coverage is extending into more and more remote areas all the time. So that's kind of frustrating. Yeah.
Well, wasn't Elon Musk looking at doing some sort of Wi-Fi that travels through the air, not from? I'm not sure exactly how it works, but isn't it like so? It's everywhere.
Yeah, one day it will be like that, I'm sure.
It's Starlink. It's already available here in these parts.
Oh, is it?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So
what are you
I'm sure Elon Musk is listening to us right now as we speak.
There we go. So, Matthias, where can people find you?
You can always find me on Instagram by my name, Mathias Nordvig. Yeah, and you can always check out my website, NordicMythologyChannel.com. Until I change it to something else. And yeah, that's really it.
Perfect. This is where I get to reel off our huge list of things.
All the things.
I've made a list this time, so I don't miss anything. So you can check us out on our Instagram, which is at Nordic Mythology Podcast on Instagram. We have a bunch of videos on our YouTube channel as well. We put some highlights on there of the new episodes. Everybody gets access to all videos after 30 days. So once a video comes out, once an episode's released, the video goes out exclusively on Patreon. After 30 days, it then hits the YouTube channel. So if you do want to see videos earlier, just pop over to our Patreon. Obviously, follow us on any tier and you get access to the video episodes right away. Over on our website, you can check out our t-shirts and our merch. They've literally just arrived with me, so they've started going out to people. I've got one on now, which is the Odin Raven t-shirt that the Raven from the North did for us. If you want to join in with any chats with myself and Mathias and other viewers, listeners, you can join us on our Discord channel. You don't have to follow us on Patreon or support us on Patreon or any of those things. It's completely free. Just pop in there. We talk about the episodes after the show and just general discussions. And obviously, if you do want to help us out a little bit more, Patreon's a brilliant way. And we have a bunch of different tiers with a load of different rewards at each level. And once we hit 100 patrons, we're going to release a brand new weekly show. It's just a watch-along show of the TV series Vikings, where me and Mathias sit down and critique the show, tell you what we like, what we don't like, have a laugh, and it'll be just like a nice little hangout style. There we go. I think I got them all. So, Chad, this has been fun. Thank you very much. Like I say, it's extremely fascinating for me. I think it's so fascinating because it's something that it's so unusual to me and out of my comfort zone. I just want to learn more and listen to things and try and understand how people would have lived and survived.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been a pleasure for me too. Eat your garlic.
Eat your garlic.
Yeah, you'll have good breath. Awesome. That's the show.